Okay, so we had some very interesting talks previously. As we kind of wind things down, we're now going to transition a little bit, and I think it's always fascinating to hear from industry because as we kind of heard earlier in academia, a lot of times, if you want to hear what's really happening, I think it's important to go out and talk to the customers. And those customers typically are folks in the industrial environment. And why is that important? Well, at the end of the day, as we kind of heard earlier with some of the comments on the nuclear side, in a sense, it's all about the money. I mean, it's great, we can talk about this is what we want to do, but if somebody can't make a profit on it, it's really hard to push it forward. So it's great having these folks here because they not only are driven for clean technology to help the environment, but at the end of the day, their companies have to make money or they wouldn't be here. So it's great to have them here and involved in this type of conference. I think we have a great combination here ranging from some different technologies to a little bit of a more scenario portfolio overview. And keeping with the previous sessions, what we'd like to do is do all three talks, and then would like to open it up for questions. So if you would hold your talks to the end, that would be great. In the first one, really, we're going to be talking about hydrogen production. As many of you know, very important here, especially with many of the trends when we talk about from a clean energy perspective. Catherine Ayers, who's here, she's a vice president of R&D. She's been involved in this area for quite some time. Catherine's background from UC San Diego, so out where I used to be in California, background in chemistry, and then a PhD at Caltech, so I think she's very well positioned for this. Proton Energy, very well known for some of the work that they've done with the proton membrane. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
So thanks for having me. I will admit that I'm also one of the people who's never been to Urbana-Champaign before, so it's been nice to see the campus and talk to some of the professors. And I'm going to start out with trying to provide a little bit of backdrop in terms of why hydrogen's important. Then I'll talk some about water splitting technologies in general and why we're working on proton exchange membrane-based electrolysis. Also, I want to touch on one of the things that Steve said on Monday, which is we really need to leverage the technologies that we have today and build from them if we're going to make an impact on energy, because it just takes so long to get from ideas to technology, and I'll touch on that a little bit in terms of this why are we not where we want to be, and how I see some of the stepping stones forward. So I found that being in this field, a lot of people don't really know the extent of hydrogen usage. It's really not just about transportation. So if we look at where hydrogen is used today, there are approximately 50 million metric tons of hydrogen produced per year globally. Hans showed that Sankey diagram, which was that diagram showing energy sources to final use. Lawrence Livermore has done that also putting hydrogen in the middle as an intermediate. And if you look at that, actually 2% of the US energy goes through hydrogen at some point before it gets to that end state. A lot of it is used in ammonia production and also in petroleum refining. But there's also a lot of other applications, methanol production. It's used as a process gas for many things, for electronics and semiconductors as a reducing gas. And then you have, more of the energy markets, fuel cells, energy storage, et cetera. So where does it come from today? Today, only about 4% of hydrogen comes from non-fossil fuel feedstocks. So hydrogen is primarily produced through steam methane reforming from natural gas, about half of it. Somebody else said earlier, a lot of it is also part of the process output from oil and coal refining. And so what we do is we try to make it from water. And one person during this conference said, well, yes, water is scarce as well. But if you look at steam methane reforming, that actually also consumes quite a bit of water. So, and if you're producing hydrogen from water and then converting it back, you can actually make a full carbon-free cycle. So if we could convert the hydrogen production to renewable sources, we could eliminate about 45% of all U.S. carbon emissions and about 2,500 million metric tons of CO2 per year. So it's important in the context of decarbonization, and it's part of what we need to do in order to get to those numbers like 80% reduction in emissions. Also, if you look at, Dow did a study, or was as part of a study, looking at a bunch of different commodity products, and it turns out that 18 of those require about 80% of the energy usage and produce about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, the largest of which is ammonia. And it's mostly because of the steam methane reforming step, because you're producing so much CO2 here. So at the same time, people have talked about this energy storage issue, and the more renewables that we add to the grid, the more storage that we're going to have, because you already are running into these overcapacity situations in some areas. I actually had the California duck curve in here, and I took it out because people have shown it already. But there are times at which there's these vast differences between the amount of renewables being produced and the need, or the other way around. And so you have to level that out with storage. And people are expecting that there's going to be further growth in renewables as we go on. So what do we do about this? So H2 at scale is something that is recently come out from DOE. You may or may not have heard about it. You can Google it. There's a webinar that was given by Brian Pivovar last month on this topic. It actually came out of Germany before it came to the US, and the idea is linking these different infrastructures, the electricity grid, transportation, industry, and trying to gain synergies through that in terms of this overall energy solution. So it's really linking the need for energy storage and the need for renewable hydrogen at the same time. So people ask me a lot about fuel cell round-trip efficiency and things like this, and that's really not the best use of hydrogen unless you're using it for transportation. But just a straight electricity to electricity, you're right, it's not a great efficiency story. Batteries are always going to be more efficient than taking power, going to hydrogen, and then going back to power. But there are all these other applications where you need hydrogen already, and if you can marry that with the excess of renewables, then you've got this flexible system that can compensate for different scenarios. And this especially makes sense where you have low-cost electricity. In other words, excess renewables. So in terms of how you do that, I want to talk a little bit about the relative technology maturity, and this is going to be important when I get to the discussion around how long it takes to actually do things. So if you look at steam methane reforming today, you can produce tens of thousands of kilograms per day of hydrogen. If you've never been to a chemical plant of any type, these things are massive engineering feats in terms of the development that has gone into these types of plants. If you look at commercial electrolysis today, we're still below that scale, but growing. So we can do, in the 100 to 1,000 kilogram a day range. This is a picture of a 1 megawatt electrolyzer. Advanced electrolysis, so even still doing water splitting with a membrane-based system, is much less mature than that. We're still at the gram to kilogram scale, and this is a picture of a test cell in our labs with some new membrane technology. So you can see, this is not a product. It is nowhere near what this is. And then finally, if you look at some of the advanced technologies, like solar thermal, this is the idea that, so if you have a volcanic eruption where you have molten rock going into water, you actually make hydrogen and oxygen. And so people are trying to say, well, maybe we can just use heat to make hydrogen and oxygen. That would be this sort of scenario. You can see the reactor here. Again, this is a very complex thing. It does work, and people are looking at how to take that forward as a technology, but it's way behind any of these things. Similarly, if you want to take light and shine it on a solar cell and directly split water, we're still at kind of the beaker stage for that. The biggest cells I've seen, because I'm on the scientific advisory board for JCAP, are about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So still a long way to go. These are like milligram per to gram per day types of scales that people are making these devices at. Okay, so a little bit about the low temperature electrolysis options. I'm not going to talk about high temperature because, first of all, I don't know that much about it. It's not my area of expertise, but also I would still put it in this kind of emerging category in terms of looking at solid oxide types of systems. But if you look at what's commercial today, it's really two things. It's systems that are based on liquid KOH, so you have essentially the same electrolyte that's in your alkaline AA batteries circulating through the system, conducting the ions. You've got a separator in between the hydrogen and oxygen electrodes, which is porous, so these two have to be at equal pressure, and it's like pH 14. The advantage is that you don't have to use platinum for some of the reactions. And it's also very well developed at scale. The membrane-based systems have a solid electrolyte, so you're actually circulating deionized water through this system, no supporting electrolyte. You can either have a proton exchange membrane, which is selective to protons, or some of the new technology that's coming out is an anion exchange membrane, which conducts hydroxide, but these are not as mature as these. These systems enable differential pressure across the membrane, so we actually electrochemically compress our hydrogen as we make it to at least 400 psi. And there's still room for development here. So as I'll talk about, the technology itself for PEM electrolysis is extremely reliable and stable, but the manufacturing is still in its childhood. So where is PEM electrolysis today? I think it's important for people to understand that this technology was originally developed for life support. So it was originally developed for the space station and for underwater life support on submarines. When you're developing a system for that type of application, the way you design it is completely different than when you're trying to make a commodity chemical. So the safety around this is the absolute priority and not cost at all. But our founders said, well, we think we can take this technology and make it less expensive and use it for hydrogen generation. So we already had this extremely reliable platform to build from, but it was highly over-designed. And I will also say that hydrogen and water electrolysis has had far less investment than fuel cells have, and so it's behind in terms of technical status. But if you look at the reliability, this is a plot that shows some of our older designs over 60,000 hours, which is about 8 years. This is a 4 microvolt per hour decay rate, so very slow decays over very long times. And if you look at our newer designs, there's even less decay. So we've improved some of the membrane and catalyst materials. If you look at the field, from 2006, when we made a fairly major change, to now, 94% of the cells that we fielded are still out there. And of the 6% that came back, 80% of that is because the customer put bad water into the system. And so we've really tried to educate our customers on putting in water quality systems, et cetera, which is really only about 2% of the whole unit cost if they add a water purifier. So the technology itself is highly reliable. We've gone through several platform iterations, and I just put this chart up here to point out that, electrolysis is up here at this, 400 kilograms per day, 800 kilogram per day scale. If you look at solar fuels, they're still way back here in this gray bar here. But we only have a few more generations probably to go to get to gigawatt scale in electrolysis. Okay, so how long does it take to get there? Well, we started with a technology that was already rated for outer space in 1996, and it's still taken us, 18 years to get to megawatt scale. So we've gone through several iterations, and I'll talk a little bit about what drives the steps along the way. But you can see that as we've gone forward, the price per kilowatt from our smaller units to the larger units have come down quite a bit. That's largely because the balance of plant does not scale with the volume of capacity that you're making. And we've steadily introduced new products along the way for different applications, and these replace different types of on-site gas delivery. So given that, I would say that if you're looking at decarbonizing hydrogen from water splitting, only electrolysis is going to impact the first 20 years. So even if I take what I think are pretty aggressive growth rates, both for electrolysis and for some of these newer technologies. And I've talked to DOE and some of the people who are working in these areas, and they agree that these numbers for photoelectrochemistry and solar thermal are aggressive in terms of getting to these types of capacities. So you don't even really see it until about 2040. I would also say that we need to do better than this across the board. So if we want, this is, gigawatts. If we want to make a terawatt impact, we need to do better on all technologies, whether it's electrolysis or these advanced technologies. Okay, so why does this take so long? Well, first of all, it's not just about materials and coming up with better performing materials. Manufacturing is its own science. There's a lot of process variables that you have to optimize. Durability testing takes time, so we've already demonstrated 7 to 10 year durability. We don't want to put a new product out there that's less durable. We also don't want to test things for 7 years, so we have to figure out ways to accelerate that process. And also interactions can derail you. So even if you've come up with something that works really well, it's fairly repeatable, once you combine all the different variables and dimensions and process and everything else that you can have in a process, you can have a certain percentage of things that fall outside the range of acceptability. And so you have to understand all that before you put a product out there. And finally, trying to design for safety and code compliance adds even another level of complexity to that. So the risks of shortcutting that, I'm not saying anything, this is not meant to be an editorial on lithium-ion batteries. I think they're very reliable. But if you look at some of the incidents that happened with some certain designs that were out there, you saw battery fires and things like this because of packaging issues and other dendrites and things that people hadn't predicted in the process models that they had gone through. So it's very important to look at these kind of things before you put products out there. And finally, you have to have, as a business, you have to have a market. It's not enough just to have a great technology. And so for us, we've always had a new product, a new application to go after to launch a product for. So we started with the little laboratory units where we're replacing carrier gas, helium carrier gas with hydrogen. We moved from there to weather balloon filling, then to actually, a lot of people don't realize that many power plants use hydrogen as a cooling fluid, so that takes our larger systems. And not just now, we're getting more into the energy storage and biogas. And there's other industrial applications as well. But it's really hard to say, I'm going to take a technology for energy storage, I'm going to go from the lab directly to megawatt scale. You have to have kind of these jumps in between. Then finally, I'll say that implementation always lags where we are with R&D. So to explain this chart a little bit, this is showing from a baseline what these different variables have done over time. So we've shown in the lab that we can take catalyst loading down quite a bit. We can take the membrane thickness down by quite a bit, and the cost of the bipolar assembly. At the same time, we've been working on scale, as you saw, and so most of our internal dollars have been focused on this, such that if you look at our actual commercial products today, those variables, catalysts, membrane, et cetera, are still up here where we know we've demonstrated down here. And a lot of that, again, is choosing where your dollars go, because we're a commercial company, we have to make money. I was at an ARPA-E summit a couple of years ago with a guy who was talking about his experience in industry and going from a big company where he didn't think twice about signing off on a $10,000 expense to going to a small company where somebody wanted a box of pens, and he's like, why do you need a whole box? So, I mean, we're not quite that bad, but you have to consider these things and make choices. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about the perceptions versus where I think the potential is for electrolysis, and then show how that's, I think, a building block for other technologies. So first is the platinum problem. A lot of people say, well, you're never going to have enough platinum to address a terawatt type of problem. First of all, if you look at the amount of platinum and iridium, because we use iridium on the oxygen side, that are accessible, this is a study that Jan Rosmiesel did. You have about 0.1 terawatts per year of annual production if you look at how we make systems today. Now, we see pathways to get to much lower loadings than we're currently using, and I would also say that people are innovative. As you start to run into constraints, you're going to start to figure out new ways to get past those. Plus, I think that as the anion exchange membranes mature, there will be an opportunity to switch from the systems that we're using today over to these other types of materials where we can migrate to other types of catalysts. People also ask me a lot about scale and cost, so we're at megawatt scale already. It's manufacturing that's our biggest cost issue right now, not catalyst. So catalyst is about 10% of the system cost. And we're already cost competitive in industrial markets. I mean, people like to talk about how expensive electrolysis is if you're talking about energy markets, but those are very stringent cost requirements. If you look at people who need hydrogen, they're perfectly happy to buy systems from us and generate it on site, because if you're far enough away from a reforming plant, then it's just as expensive to buy it from a gas company. And then finally, if you look at where NREL has looked at cost of hydrogen, where we are today, I would say this is fairly accurate. I'd say we're probably closer to $5 a kilogram. If you take manufacturing volumes, you can take probably 25 to 30% of the cost out. Then a lot of this depends on electricity cost, and then conversion to these other types of systems like the AEM systems. So the ongoing advancements that we're looking at leverage a lot of the fuel cell development. We're looking at things like advanced catalysts, thinner membranes, coatings, different types of manufacturing methods, and I could spend a whole other talk talking about all the things that we're trying to do there. But I would say really the important thing for us is collaboration, and that's what I wanted to kind of leave people with in the last few slides. We have a very challenging cell environment. We have an acidic electrolyte, so even though the circulating fluid is neutral, these materials are up against an acidic material. It's highly oxidizing on the oxygen side, and it's high pressure on the hydrogen side. So, I mean, I have a very interesting job because we've got materials issues in metallurgy, polymers, catalysts, et cetera. We need to understand the porosity of the gas diffusion layers and how do you get water in and gas out. And so we work a lot with different universities, national labs, other companies, et cetera. Almost every government project I have has a partner on it who has got more of the fundamental skills to look at some of these materials. And on the flip side, I think that we from industry can offer them much more perspective on cell design and the constraints around manufacturing so that they can really understand how to help us get beyond them. And then finally, I think if we're going to get to addressing gigawatt and terawatt scale problems, as I said in the beginning and as Steve said, we need the new technologies to build from our existing legacy, because otherwise, even if you have a strong technical foundation, getting to these types of systems becomes an insurmountable cliff. So if you can leverage things like understanding how to put catalysts on membrane materials and how to handle large active area electrodes and how to manufacture things at scale and how to design hydrogen safe systems that are safe, then you can use those as stepping stones to get to where we need to be. And for that, we need collaboration between industry and academia. Finally, we tend to use a lot of synergistic technologies to advance our technology forward as well. So the things that we're doing can both contribute to things like flow batteries, microbial fuel cells, potentially electrochemical conversion of nitrogen to ammonia. And that's how we build our research program, is to look at all these different things that have commonalities so that we can both advance our commercial products and look to the future. So I think that whatever the end system is in 2050 is going to be the most cost-effective option at that time. And so what we need to do is develop transferable capability on the platforms that we have and use that so that we can follow this manufacturing cost curve and substitute new materials later, but you have all that already developed. So finally, I would say that I think hydrogen is an essential part of decarbonization. We really need to be realistic about the time frames and how long it takes to start from a new idea and take it to a commercial product at scale. So we need to address near-term needs as well as new science and find synergies between those so that we can drive progress. And this is just a collage of some of the agencies that have funded us and the fueling station at Proton with some of the Toyota vehicles that we have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for kicking off this session, which very interesting presentation. We're from kind of the details of electrolysis now, we're moving on to kind of a broader discussion. And it's always fun to introduce someone who's also an alumni of U of I. It's great to have you back. So we've got Haroon Kheshgi from ExxonMobil. Haroon has done a lot in this area, very, very well known. Is actually a distinguished research associate at ExxonMobil, and has been involved in a number of areas, including carbon capture, which is one of the ones that I love quite a bit. So without ado, Haroon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm Haroon Kheshgi. I joined Exxon Corporate Research about a little over 30 years ago, and soon after joining, I started doing research associated with climate change. My role at ExxonMobil is really to serve as expert capacity on climate change for the corporation. And over time, I've gained that expertise both through my own research, largely in collaboration with others. For example, I've collaborated with Atul Jain for many years now. Also participation in the research community and interaction with expert practitioners on a variety of topics, and involvement in assessments like the assessments of the IPCC. So I'm going to share some thoughts about the topic of my talk today on technology and a low carbon transformation. We've already had a few talks now in the session talking about going to zero carbon or net zero carbon, and looking at scenarios, for example, over the next century. And of course, when you look at a scenario over the next century for the economy, for technology, there's huge uncertainties, heroic assumptions involved in that. And so it's important to think of those scenarios just as that, as scenarios, and how those types of scenarios can inform your overall task, which is really to manage risks from climate change for society. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to make some comments about CO2 stabilization and the pace of transformation. There's been a focus recently on, more in recent times, really on very low levels of stabilization. And that would imply a very fast pace for this type of transformation. And so that raises other issues or brings other issues to the fore. And so I'm going to look at transformation pathways. These are the scenarios that the research community has put together to look at, for example, what technologies might come into play in scenarios for the future. I'm going to look at enabling environments for technology deployment. If these things are going to happen quickly, you actually need to have an enabling environment to make these kinds of investments to change the infrastructure for the world to do this. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about that. And of course, part of risk management is sort of an approach for technology as a portfolio approach. If you don't know really what technologies are going to end up succeeding, it's important to have a research portfolio so you have a good chance of progressing things. So to start with, this is a very simple chart back from the early 2000s that looks at CO2 stabilization. These are simply three illustrative pathways going to three different CO2 levels. You can think of one as being a high level, one a medium level, one a low level, 450 ppm CO2. Associated with those pathways, if one runs a global carbon cycle model, you find that to follow that type of pathway, net anthropogenic emissions need to peak and then decline towards zero. The time at which those emissions peaks is nearer for low stabilization levels, later for later stabilization levels. Another way to think of these kinds of pathways as well is what's entailed within them. All these types of pathways involve some sort of efficiency improvement. There's already efficiency improvement occurring. That occurs through technologies, for example, in appliances, insulation in buildings, improvement in vehicle efficiency. But in a way, it's also important to recognize this is overall efficiency of use of energy in the economy. And so there are many, many ways in which that can be improved. Furthermore, to go towards zero emissions, one ultimately needs to decarbonize the global economy. And so that can be done by moving to lower carbon fuels like natural gas, followed by CCS, by nuclear energy, by renewables. We've talked about all those at some level in the discussions earlier in this conference. And what's found in integrated assessment models, the way they get to very low levels of CO2 concentration is to start to include technologies that have negative greenhouse gas emissions. And typically in an integrated assessment model, they do that by basically growing biomass on vast expanses of land, burning that biomass for electricity or some other purpose, and then sequestering the CO2 from that underground. One can sort of look at the extent to which these happen in these types of scenarios through these different metrics. You can look at energy intensity as a metric for energy efficiency. You can look at carbon per unit energy as a metric for decarbonization. And what's shown in this table first are the values for the current, where we are today. So right now we're at about 12, on average, 12 megajoules per dollar GDP. If you look at these four different scenarios, or three different scenarios into the future, and these are the ones that were highlighted in the IPCC's most recent assessment. A high scenario, RCP 8.5, there's still an improvement in energy efficiency. RCP 4.5, further improvement. RCP 2.6, a very low scenario, something you can sort of think of it as a 2 degree or a 450 ppm scenario. Efficiency improvements is greater. If you look at, and this is in 2050, if you look at the carbon per unit energy in 2050, RCP 8.5 is shown has not much different than today. RCP 4.5 is lower, but there's a big gap then between 4.5 and 2.6. And I see that as if you look at energy outlooks of a variety of kinds, these types of numbers for 4.5 are not uncharacteristic going forward, but 2.6 is. So that there is a big challenge going from 4.5 to 2.6, and a lot of issues get raised in trying to do that type of decarbonization that rapidly. In addition, what's shown on the right side of the chart are sort of, according to the IPCC, the temperature rise expected in 2100 for those types of scenarios. So RCP 2.6 leads in their scenarios to sort of a median or mean response among models of 1.6 degrees. And so when you think about the Paris Agreement, where they are looking for well under 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, that's the kind of scenario that would be one would think about in relation to that. We can sort of look at progress towards very low carbon emissions by considering considering scenarios. For example, this is our results from a scenario put together by IEA, International Energy Agency. They're from their technology perspectives report back a few years. In that report, it looked at, to get to, in this case, 50% reduction in emissions by 2050 globally, which in their case was their DS2 scenario at that time, a 2 degree scenario. They estimated the number of additions of different types of power plants over that period out to 2050. And if you simply just sort of looked at what the annual additions would average out to be over that time, it ends up being 30 large, 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants per year, 55 CCS plants, 15,000 wind turbines, a lot of area of solar power. And if you sort of looked at since from the decade from 2005 to 2015 at the annual additions, for the first three of those, particularly for the first two, it was vastly underperformed. Basically, less than one annual addition in net globally. Solar power actually overachieved to some extent, and we've already heard a little bit about the drop in solar PV module costs. If you then prorate that now to the new period just to get the same number of additions, the challenge is even greater. Of course, this focuses on electric power, and there's a lot of reasons to look at electric power. There's, in a way, if you're looking at estimates of cost of abatement of emissions, there's some low-hanging fruit in the electric power sector. However, to get towards zero emissions, we really need to think about emissions across the economy. So this is a Sankey diagram that we produced as part of the industry chapter of the IPCC. And it looks at emissions by service, by sector, and by fuel. And as you can see, emissions are spread across the economy. And so in a sense, to do this transformation, it's not enough just to decarbonize the power sector. One needs to actually look at how you could use that decarbonized electricity or how you could do other things to decarbonize across the economy. And so it spans a wide range of technologies. It's not really a small set of things, although there could be important technologies within that. I'm going to now move on to looking at transformation pathways, and these are really scenarios over the next 100 years. And as I mentioned before, it's important to recognize first there's important assumptions about what's going to happen to climate policy. There's important assumptions about, and these which are not very transparent, and what the enabling environments for changes in infrastructure are going to be. And in the end, a lot of the models that do this, in a way, are models that are trying to look at economic approaches to mitigating emissions. And Mike had mentioned this earlier in his talk. So here's, just to give you an example, here's the range of scenarios that were assessed in the last IPCC assessment. To illustrate these, they picked a few representative concentration pathways, and those were meant at the time that they picked those to span sort of the range from the extreme high to the extreme low of emission scenarios to be representative of that range. As I mentioned, it's important to recognize the uncertainties, and it's important also then to think about how do you think about using this kind of information. And these are some quotes from the front page of the summary for the America's Climate Choices report, which was a major report that was put out by the National Research Council in 2011. And in that, it recognizes the inherent complexity and the uncertainty, and it highlights the importance of an iterative risk management approach. And so in a way, it's important to take on board information from different kinds of scenarios or different kinds of information, make a plan, but also revise that plan as you go forward, because you're going to learn new things. And that's why, for example, if you look at different energy outlooks, if you look at the IEA's energy outlook, they make a new outlook every year. It's not, the outlook lasts 40 years, but they make a new one every year because there's new information every year. It also mentions the importance of a portfolio approach in this, since that's a way of hedging risks in a sense if some things don't work out. This is one way the IPCC looked at mitigation, the importance of different sort of classes of technology in mitigating climate change. And as you can see in this chart, and one of the criticisms of the IPCC is that their charts are very complicated. And so this is an example. They pack a lot of information in here. Different technologies have different importance at different stabilization levels. If we focus really on the upper left corner of that, at the importance of CO2 capture and storage in the very low scenario, in the 450 scenario, you think of that as a 2-degree scenario, we can see that has the absence of CCS in the models that produced results was more than a factor or 2 higher. The cost was more than a factor or 2 higher. But perhaps more important than that is more than half the models that were considered in this exercise weren't able to produce a solution without CCS. They weren't able to get to that level. And while there's a huge range, actually, which isn't covered in this, and what the actual cost of mitigation is, that's not really understood very well for a variety of reasons. I'm going to touch on a couple of them. It does indicate the importance of CCS in this. In order to get a little better understanding that, I'm going to dig into one model's results. It's sometimes hard to understand, these types of charts give you an idea of what a span of models gives, but each model, in a way, has a different pathway. And so I'm going to dig into a little bit of research that we've recently been doing in collaboration with P&L, Pacific Northwest National Labs, and their integrated assessment group. And so this is looking at different scenarios going to different levels of mitigation, and looking at the importance of CCS across fuels and sectors, since this is one of the models that was included in that IPCC assessment. First, we see greater mitigation in electricity generation in the near term, and that's seen in many of the models, or almost all the models. That's associated with sort of the low-hanging fruit, at least when you want to make deep reductions in emissions. Next, we see the least cost pathways for this model, and this model in these cases, drives mitigation by having a global price on carbon, a price that increases with time, so the price gets to be quite high as you get to the second half of the century. That includes CCS deployed across both electricity and liquid fuels in this model's results. And you can see that in the top panels and the bottom panels. And it's interesting to see in this that this model doesn't really have much bioenergy without CCS. Almost all the bioenergy that gets implemented in this model gets implemented with CCS. And the reason that that occurs in this model is because that system, which has negative net emissions, occurs in the second half of the century, predominantly in the second half of the century when the price of carbon is extremely high. And if you can imagine, if you have negative emissions, the reward in terms of that price for that technology gets to be overwhelming, and so that tends to happen. Whether that would happen in reality or not is a different question. Here's another way of looking at these kinds of results. This is looking at the extent of mitigation across different end-use sectors. And so this, as you can see in this, industry and buildings have greater mitigation than transportation. And if you look at transportation itself, there's, what's seen actually, if you look at a variety of different energy outlooks, is there's a growth in freight emissions, and that growth in freight emissions eventually surpasses the emissions from light-duty vehicles. And so you can see how important freight becomes compared to other emissions going into the future. And as you could tell from this conference, and I've been to many conferences, there tends to be a much greater interest in light-duty vehicles than in freight. I'm now going to switch a little bit towards enabling environments for technology deployment. And we just heard a session on nuclear energy where enabling environments are extremely important, and that's sort of, you can think of that as one example of this. Another where governments have been working towards creating an enabling environment is for CCS. And one of the processes I got involved in was back in 2005. The G8 had a request to IEA and CSLF to make recommendations for what they should do in terms of progressing CCS as an option and improving it as an option. After 5 years, that process came up with a report of recommendations. There were somewhat motherhood recommendations related to CCS. Here's the list that report had. There's been some progress on all of these, but I don't think anyone would claim there's been a success or a complete success in any one of these. So there are still some, and the enabling environment for CCS still is challenging. For example, the legal and regulatory frameworks for CCS, while there's some that are being drafted or in place, those haven't played out to see how one could make an investment, how reliable that would be. Yet CCS could be perhaps the most important one in the long term for mitigation of emissions. Another way to think of enabling environments is through, one thing, and sort of almost a little bit of an aside on this, is we talked about climate change and the priority for climate change, but it's important to recognize that climate change is one of many priorities. And so in thinking about climate policy or thinking about adaptation to climate change, it's important to think of how that actually coincides with other policies for other things, and which might affect the enabling environment for those. Or how do you think of adaptation to climate change in response to risk management more generally for other risks that others face? And this is a table from the Working Group 2 of the IPCC. Sorry if these are hard to read, but this looks at across economic sectors, what's the importance of climate impacts compared to other drivers for those sectors. And by and large, for almost all the sectors, climate change is a secondary driver. And so when one thinks about, for example, adaptation, those sectors are already, exposed to a significant risk from a variety of factors, as risks or opportunities. So it's important to sort of think of how you mainstream those types of climate considerations into that type of risk management. Barriers are important. We've heard a little bit about that. For example, we often hear about that related to energy efficiency in buildings. This was a table we put together for the industry sector. Industries faced with the wide range of changes that would be associated with the transformation. It's faced with a wide range of barriers. And the types of pathways that I've discussed in a way, they tend to have a very simplistic and non-transparent way of including barriers. They may have some limit on the pace at which a technology could change, for example. But it's important to maybe get more transparency and connection to what's actually happening in some way of measuring whether these are occurring. One piece of work that we're doing is to try to think of a framework that these types of models could include these types of barriers. And I guess part of that is recognizing that the extent of barriers in the future is an assumption. And so in a sense, part of scenarios into the future is going to involve, what is your scenario in a sense for how barriers might evolve? Because in the end, that's going to be, not only is climate policy going to be a choice, policies that might address barriers is also going to be a choice, or it might just be an environment or investment environment that the investments face. Finally, I wanted to say a couple words about technology portfolios. We had a lot of ideas about, discussions about different technologies that could be important. In the end, no one can predict really what's going to be successful in the marketplace. Portfolios are used, and this is just to give you an idea. This is the portfolio in ExxonMobil of research that we're doing outside of our normal business lines. And so we're doing things that look at increasing supply, expanding energy access. So we're looking at what might happen in those markets that we're not really participating in, like in Africa, places like that. We're looking at improving efficiency, mitigating emissions. We're doing research on CCUS. We're doing research, for example, on biofuels. And we're also looking at science issues in a way, and climate change lies in that, and that's kind of the bucket that I lie in within the portfolio of work that we're doing. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Haroon. That was a very intriguing talk, kind of a great overview that kind of sets it up as we transition over now to Krishnamurthy, who's from Linde Corporation. Krish received his bachelor's from University of Madras and then his master's and PhD from Clarkson. I know Krish very well because, as many of you know here, we are trying to do a large-scale carbon capture system, retrofitting the Abbott plant, and that is with the Linde technology. And as you can imagine, putting in a DOE proposal, we've met many a long night trying to put together that proposal. So, Krish, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and I appreciate the opportunity to attend this Congress and also give our perspectives from the Linde perspective. I want to start off with a 5-minute video that represents clean technology. If I can find this. Sorry. How do I get to the desktop? Some videos were put in the desktop.
Oh, you want a video? Sorry.
Do you know how to get to the desktop?
Here we go, best to the rescue.
Sorry about that.
At the Linde Group, we believe the only way to solve the global energy dilemma is to come clean. We're committed to the long-term development of clean energy solutions that will be key for sustainable growth. We can get there in many ways. Off the coast of Norway, we developed and built Europe's largest natural gas liquefaction plant under some of the strictest environmental regulations. To take gas exploration further, we and our partners are developing floating LNG factories out in the open sea. Now, it's possible to tap smaller, isolated reserves wherever they're found and bring the liquefied gas to where it's needed, economically. Natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel, and when liquefied at -162 degrees Celsius, it can easily be transported anywhere. To heat homes, generate electricity, to fuel road and maritime transportation. No wonder it's becoming more popular. The global demand for energy is expected to double by 2050. Coal is going to be indispensable for the next few decades. Keeping it clean will be critical. Carbon capture and storage can help tackle climate change. Our clean technology helps power plants rise to the challenge by capturing CO2 before and after combustion. But what more can we do with CO2? Which got us thinking, what if we take the CO2 we emit and use it to grow plants? So we did. We teamed up with a partner in the Netherlands to supply over 550 greenhouses with recycled CO2 from a refinery, enabling an additional growing season. And why stop there? By feeding CO2 to blue-green algae under the right conditions, our partners can use them to produce environmentally sound biofuels, a serious improvement. Today, large-scale solar panels can be mass-produced. We supply specialty gases like fluorine to help improve the production process. We're just getting started, and the future looks bright. In California, for example, we've teamed up with a major waste management company to develop a system that converts landfill gas into fuel for waste disposal trucks, reducing their carbon footprint and making them cheaper to operate. It's the largest biogas production facility of its kind in the world. And it's beautiful. The trash runs on trash. All said and done, the lightest element in the universe might have the biggest impact. Hydrogen, the 21st century fuel for mobility without emissions. An excellent medium for storing electricity from renewable sources, and an exciting opportunity for growth. Linde has the will, the technology, and the expertise to play a leading role. We've joined forces with premier companies in private and public transportation to pave the way for our hydrogen future.
So the video illustrates the wide range of clean energy technologies that we participate in through our gases and large-scale engineering capabilities. So I just want to touch on a couple of examples which further illustrate some recent developments. So we are engaged in a number of different projects throughout the world. Several of these projects, as touched in the video, on carbon capture, developing lighthouse projects in carbon capture to show the benefits, as well as also linking it to the enhanced oil recovery opportunities, because that's a big sink that can provide the first transition in storing carbon. We also have promoting LNG as a fuel. For example, in Europe, in the Baltic Sea, there's strict regulations in sulfur, and therefore all the marine transportation is converting to LNG, natural gas firing. So that's something that we do with medium-sized terminals, LNG terminals, to serve the market. Hydrogen is also a key push for Linde from our perspective, and again with partners, as it was said in the video, promoting a number of projects through fueling stations, as well as hydrogen infrastructure, and also on the generation side. So we see the balance of security of supply of energy, economics, and environment as being critical to promote sustainability over time. And again, these pilot projects show the benefit of achieving that over the long term. I'm going to pass on some of this because of time. So one of the largest examples of carbon capture, particularly on offshore gas, we did it in Norway. This is a LNG plant, and when the gas is extracted from offshore, it comes with several percent of CO2, and that we captured that CO2 and re-injected into the reservoirs, showing the cycle without kind of CO2 emissions. I talked about the terminals that we are installing for promoting the marine use of LNG fuel. So on carbon capture, we participate in all three pathways, pre-combustion, oxy-fuel, and post-combustion. In terms of near term, our focus is on solvent-based capture, because from a large-scale perspective, it has been applied in other applications, and therefore we feel that to take it to commercial quickly would be rather more simplified than the other approaches. So for this, we have partnered with BASF on the development of their solvent-based technology and applying it at scale. And over the past decade, we've taken it from laboratory development. Although CO2 capture has been practiced in natural gas and syngas applications, the big difference with the power plant flue gas is the contaminants as well as the presence of oxygen, which causes oxidative degradation of the solvent. So we've shown over multiple pilot plants, the last one being successfully completed at the National Carbon Capture Center in Alabama, that this technology works. And we also show a pathway where we can take the price down to about $40 a ton CO2 captured when applied at scale. And as Kevin mentioned, the next step in that development is what we are planning here in the Abbott power plant with the university. Show a little bit of that. So this is led by the university at the Abbott power plant, and we are partnering along with BASF to bring this technology to scale. So it will be at the 15 megawatt or 300 tons of CO2 per day. And this is also the longer term for the universities to promote CO2 utilization options through either liquefaction or transport of the gas. On the hydrogen, we cover the entire scale, and I just want to touch on a couple of examples from production using conventional steam methane reforming. We have a large number of plants in that arena, to also the production of green hydrogen, both using biomass as well as renewable electricity. We are involved in a number of different storage options, which are critical to promoting the applications. For the fueling stations, we have come up with a new technology, compression technology called ionic compressors, which uses liquid piston instead of the mechanical compression, and thereby achieves isothermal type energy consumption, which is quite low compared to the other options. When large amount of liquid is available, as in the US, then we need to have pumps that could take it to very high pressures for vaporization and use. And we also have dispensing technology for the fueling stations. So all of this is necessary to put the entire infrastructure together and to promote the number of stations that ought to be built. So some of the things about hydrogen that has happened, the transition that's happening in the last 5 years is that standardization of components is causing the lowering of prices of the infrastructure like fueling stations. The protocol is standardized, so it's more broadly used, both from the car perspective as well as with the participation of OEMs, and also from the industrial gas perspective on the supply side. It's possible to achieve 3-minute filling, which is a critical component, and also the range with the storage at 750 bars, being able to take between 325 to 400 miles. So from a use perspective, the fuel cell cars with hydrogen are ahead in terms of compared to the electric cars, which have other benefits, but also some issues in terms of range and fueling time. One of the first examples of a commercial implementation of hydrogen at reasonable scale is the forklift trucks. These are used in large warehouses, and in this facility of BMW at Spartanburg, there are 350 of these forklift trucks filling every day about a ton of hydrogen per day. And this is one of the largest fueling systems we set up. Here, the traditional way is batteries, and from a productivity and use perspective, it provides advantages to the end user that they've embraced this solution over the last several years. Yesterday's keynote speaker in the evening showed the fueling station that we have put, one of several in California, which is now open to public. And the fueling infrastructure, again, as I said, there's a lot of automation gone into that with very little change for the end user from the gas stations to the hydrogen station. Also popular is the fleet use of hydrogen, and this is one example in the Bay Area with AC Transit. One of the recent innovation that we are promoting is a car share program in Munich. So there are 50 cars to be introduced, just like Uber, but using hydrogen fuel cell cars in the Munich area. So we see this as an opportunity to promote that use. Finally, also on the production side, Kathy talked about it earlier about the electrolysis, PEM electrolysis. So we have shown the entire infrastructure around generation using renewable power and its use, storage and use. So here in Mainz in Germany, we put together 3 electrolysis systems, 2 megawatt for 6 megawatt capacity total. The project is in the completion stage, is already producing hydrogen and storing it. The main use for the hydrogen in this case is to actually put it into the grid, because at a small percentage addition to the grid with natural gas, it is one of the ways it can be distributed, and it's shown significant benefit in this case. But also we can take the stored hydrogen for multiple uses. Obviously, in the large scale, we have to find the applications to promote it, and that's one of the things we are doing along with the lowering the cost of production. That I would like to end, and I guess for any questions.
Well, thank you, Krish, for an insightful overview of what's happening at Linde. I'd say we have time for probably about 2 questions there. And I have a mic that I guess I'll roll around here if anyone have any questions.
I'm loud enough, so you don't need any. But if you want to use it, I don't know if my Iranian accent, that's I see. Okay, but you want to take it what? Okay. My question is really to any of the 3 distinguished speakers we have here. You guys, please, in answering this question, please wear your industrial hat, because some of you guys are probably more academic than you think you are. You know that the mentality in industry and university environment is different. For example, at the university level, we have restriction on travel, ordering things, hiring and firing staff, where you don't have it. You can hire somebody on the spot, and you can fire somebody on the spot if they don't perform well. So with that background, what do you think should be the role of university in technology transformation? I'm not talking about developing technology and going from lab to bench. I'm talking about pilot and demonstration scale before the technology becomes commercialization. This is something I struggled at university for 30 years, and I just want to know what you guys think the university role should be in that kind of approach. Or any of the speakers would be fine. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Since, as I mentioned, we leverage universities quite a bit, I could try to answer that. So we typically use universities a lot for fundamental understanding. So if we have a material that's giving us confusing behavior, we want to characterize it, we want to look at mechanisms, that's one of the ways that we use our university partners. In other cases, we will create a team where we're leveraging, developing new membranes. We might have a university partner who's coming up with chemistry, but then we have a membrane partner who's willing to cast that chemistry. They're making polymers and actually fabricating films that then we test. So I think you kind of need to look at the whole continuum. I would also say that the best students I've found are the ones that can look across that area and not be totally focused. So a lot of times we'll actually bring some of the students into our facility for a few weeks so that they can actually work, right next to our researchers and really understand, oh, this is how you do that and this is why, so that they can go back to the lab and say, well, what if I do this? Is that going to make a difference? So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah, the cross-cutting areas of science and technology where, in implementing projects, sometimes we lack the time to go into deeper understanding of the problems that come about. And that's where the partnership with universities provide us a lot of insights through modeling and simulation or understanding of materials, as Kathy talked about. Those are critical. We don't have the luxury to have all the resources to address that in a timely manner. And by access to university know-how and response to that, we can jointly get solutions to quickly.
I guess my question is that if you guys have an idea that you want to commercialize, would you trust the university to lead that project for you guys or not?
Well, you see the example at the Abbott. The answer is it depends. Obviously, we first have to assess the nature of the project and how it's set up and what capabilities are brought into that. Definitely, we have some expertise internally that we want to push forward with, but obviously we need complementary capabilities from universities, and that's the key to partnerships.
I think at this stage, since we're running a little bit late, I would like to wrap up the session. And if you have any additional questions, we'll have the speakers around, of course, during the lunch. And let's give everyone a hand again for coming here.